been falling for 30 minutes!
Welcome back, everyone. I've been expecting you. The mood of Halloween has risen once again, and here I am about to tell you a story of a ritual that has been performed. About 2 years ago, I made a review on one of the games that helped define the Metroidvania subgenre of games. And it was not only a game I still love playing, but it was a game that left a legacy behind. So after a time of some games from that same series getting released, and after complications, the creator chose to set out on his own adventure, to keep the spirit of those games alive however possible. And thus, the ritual of the night was performed. In more normal terms, Koji Igarashi started to have mixed feelings towards Konami's work culture in the early to mid 2010s, and I'm sure no one could blame him. So he wanted to continue his take on the Castlevania series outside the company, saw the success of the My Number 9 Kickstarter campaign, and chose to do his own for a new IP that could see his vision and ideas through. Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. I've already talked about this in a previous video where I covered Curse of the Moon 1 and 2, which you can catch up in that card, but this game was really what that campaign was for. It aimed to appeal more to fans of explorative Castlevania titles like the ones he made, with an open 2D world that let you explore, find power-ups, and use them to go further. And people were more than happy to contribute to this cause, as this became one of the most famous examples of a successful Kickstarter campaign. I guess you could argue that it did play a part in the subgenre sort of coming back into the minds of larger companies, since I think a lot of us believe that, despite how My Number 9 turned out, that campaign played a big part in both keeping the spirit of Mega Man alive and the creation of Mega Man 11. Sure, Metroidvanias remained happy and healthy within indie companies, but those were different people keeping things fresh for it, when Nintendo and Konami simply weren't doing that, Konami especially. I did try to play this when it first came out, but my laptop straight up didn't have the specs to run it, so I put it down for a long time. Even when I got a much more capable computer for Christmas that year, I did have another chance, and I got Indivisible instead. Now granted, that game is awesome, but I still didn't pay Bloodstained much mind then. Well, that changes now. So how is it? Well, time we set foot into this castle and check it out. I should mention this before I start discussing the story. Curse of the Moon is not at all needed in order to understand this game's plot. The two take place within their own timelines, so they are very much their own thing. With that said, this game takes place in the 18th century, around the time the Industrial Revolution is happening. The changes have unfortunately displeased the Alchemy Guild, who would rather rely on magic and science in order to create what they'd like. So in an act of desperation to prevent the change, they forcibly fused a selection of humans with demonically powered crystals, giving them supernatural powers. These became known as Shardbinders, who were then used by the guild in order to summon demons from the underworld. And summoning demons is never good. So many innocent lives were taken, and the church banished the guild for their practices. But two Shardbinders remained, those being Jeeble, who survived the torture he went through while in captivity, and Miriam, who entered a deep slumber for some weird reason. After 10 years, Miriam awakens and discovers that Jeeble has begun his revenge on the Alchemy Guild for their actions by summoning demons himself. Gee, he really was tortured that badly, wasn't he? And if that wasn't bad, he also decided to summon a giant castle called the Hellhold to act as his base. So Miriam, along with Dominique, a church exorcist, and Johannes, an alchemic apprentice, decide to go to the castle, stop the demons, and hopefully do something about Jeeble. Along the way, they come toe-to-toe with Zangetsu, who hates demons and Shardbinders, and wishes to stop the outbreak through his own means, and Alfred, who is looking for the Liber Legaeth, which is an ancient book capable of summoning demons. Based on that description, the Liber Legaeth does sound like a central part of this plot, but Alfred isn't willing to tell Miriam why he wants it. In fact, he tries to keep her out of the conflict, even going as far as to threaten her with murder. Now, there is a lot more I'm not touching upon, because while the overall threat remains consistent, the character motivations do add a layer of complexity to the game overall. Likewise with any Igarashi Metroidvania, a lot of the plot is discovered by how much you explore the castle. The story does get the job done in terms of everything it has to offer. Each character is well defined, the stakes are made very clear, and I feel like there's enough intrigue and mystery in order to keep your interest. The destination might seem straightforward at first glance, but trust me, if you go that way, then there will be plenty more you're going to miss out on. More on the Liber Legaeth, and more on the character motivations are looked into depending on what you decide to do. The characters I feel overall serve their purpose, and I have plenty to like about them. Miriam does carry a big burden, and she really doesn't have much time for nonsense, but she's also got a bit of a sweet and snarky side to her that makes for some admittedly fun and sweet interactions with the others, especially towards Johannes and Anne, this girl who she and Dominique save at the beginning of the game, and that's about it. Characters like Zangetsu and Alfred have their own reasons for being there, and they do well in giving me a reason to look forward to what else the game has in store. Meanwhile, some characters like Chibo or Dominique I can't go into without going into spoilers, so I'll just leave it at this, because part of the fun of both the game and its story is finding out everything for yourself. Oh, and there's even some background characters who do add a little more life to this world, from the aforementioned Anne, to this killer barber who can give you a new hairstyle, to the castle's librarian who is exactly who you think he is, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. I will say that I do think it could have been paced better in certain parts. Part of the reason why I think this is also tied to gameplay, sure, but the process of getting the game's true ending can feel a little haphazard. There's quite a few areas where not much is going on, and then there's parts where a lot is happening. These aren't handled badly in hindsight, I just think they could have been more evenly spread out. However, in terms of what the story wants to do, it accomplished it pretty well. I did care for the characters, I wanted to know what was going to happen next, and it got me more in the mood to continue looking around the castle. And do you need it to do more? With this game trying to appeal to Castlevania fans, there's a lot of tries to replicate it in terms of looks, but honestly what it does do is enough to make the game feel like its own thing, and just look very pleasing. The color palette is incredibly diverse, yet the placement and the saturation does give off a mysterious and unsettling vibe. Even when things become much brighter, the feeling of not knowing what's around the corner is still present, thanks to the atmosphere. There's plenty of locations within the castle that are vast and larger than life, but there's also some far more confined and pressurized areas. And with a couple of exceptions like this hidden desert or the magma caverns, every area does feel like it's part of one centralized location. The connection between them is very believable, yet they're able to stand out on their own, without a single one blending in. I really like the art direction here too. It makes everything look a lot more striking with just the amount of detail put into it, namely the models for the human characters and the demons. The demons in particular have designs ranging of all varieties. I can really appreciate how the more beastly looking demons feel like the devs took inspiration from a classic monster and tried to add their own take to it. There's plenty that look positively grotesque, there's some that look in place, yet wouldn't look out of place in a more gothic cartoon, and there's another Shovel Knight cameo. Cutscene animations do look a little stilted, but the way they animated the character models in normal dialogue sequences do look pretty good, which I am thankful for because it gives me a better chance to appreciate the voice acting. Every line does sound like it was delivered with the right tone, and it feels like everyone cared about bringing this story to life and making it work. I mean sure, most of these are actors you see pretty commonly nowadays, like Erica Lindbeck, Ben Diskin, Ray Chase, and Frida Wolf, but there are three that just gave me a silly smile. I mentioned Anne a few times despite her not doing anything that important to the plot, because that's Rena Strober doing the voice of her. You know, the same person who voices a character I kinda like. Yeah, it's totally a me thing. But the other two are genius choices. Zangetsu's voiced by David Hayter, and if you just got the idea to make any jokes about Snake, the game pretty much gave you the exact opening to do so.
And I say, what is the difference? The alchemists were the gunmen, the shardbinders the gun. All must be dismantled.
But perhaps more importantly, if you thought about making any Castlevania jokes about the aforementioned castle librarian, they're practically already written for you, with Robert Belgrade in the role. They so knew what they were doing with these choices, and I'm so happy they made them. Actually, with those and the jokes being made about Konami properties in mind, there's plenty of other details that not only reference Castlevania, but also mock Konami for a lot of their decisions recently. Some of the enemy hunting side quests name drop characters from that series, and there's some pretty obvious jabs like an optional boss pretty much being a Belmont, and another one being a slot machine, and that's just scratching the surface. As someone who's dabbled into that series from time to time, even I smiled a lot at these. Part of that is because of some ire towards Konami, I will admit, but it's also because it shows that devs have a sense of humor, and there are some happy spots within a castle pretty much infested with the undead. And all this is amplified by the game's absolutely wonderful soundtrack. It nails a perfect compromise between atmospheric and blood pumping, and the instrumentation from the orchestra they got, to the electric guitar, to that choir, just adds to how this game feels to play. Special mentions easily go to Voyage of Promise, Gears of Fortune, Autumn's Desolation, and the boss themes, particularly the Executioners, Exorcism, and Silent Howling. I do have few issues with the game, like some dialogue boxes apparently having these weird gaps in between words, and occasional split-second pauses, but I'm willing to chalk those up to some minor PC issues. The game as a whole runs phenomenally at 60 frames per second, and it doesn't take too long in the load time department, at least on PC anyways. I hear the console versions do have a couple hiccups, especially the Switch version, but I also hear that there have been plenty of things done to patch those out. So in hindsight, any version of the game is perfectly playable, but I'd recommend the PC version if you want the most optimal performance. But no matter what, the game still looks visually wonderful, paying tribute to an old series, yet providing something new all the same. There are plenty of traditions, ritual, and light continues from prior games, but they are ones that make these kinds of games acclaimed for a reason. Miriam overall controls well, but I will admit her ground speed does feel a tiny bit slow. Each screen is overly massive, so the ground speed is unbearable, but there are some instances where I feel like a little more would be appreciated. Granted, there is some equipment in the game that can fix this, but the problem with that is that equipment augments your stats, meaning there might be something in your inventory that might be stronger, which would be more ideal for the challenges ahead. But if it's one thing I will absolutely compliment Miriam for, it's the variety of melee weapons she has. As soon as the game starts, it gives you a knife, a pair of kung fu shoes, a short sword, a claymore, and a gun to try out, and you get even more weapons as you go along the game, so I highly recommend trying them all out and seeing which ones you like. Some of them might even have hidden moves that you can perform with a button combination, and if a book tells you about one for the weapon you're using, that's even more incentive to try it. Throughout most of my playthrough though, I mostly use short swords and katanas, as they have good range, good attack speed, and good damage output, though there were a couple instances where I did switch over to spears, which have more range but can't be used as quickly. These were overall better in keeping my distance. There's plenty of weapons of every type around the map, so it's important to explore and find the ones you want to use to better prepare yourself for what's ahead. But there might be select few weapons and equipables that might pop up in Dominique's shop, along with some one-use items that are definitely handy at some point. She can also buy unwanted items or shards off of you, so it's good to pay her a visit when you just want to check up on stock, or if you just want some free cash. Paying Johanna's visits is recommended as well, since he can craft you new weapons and equipables that can help your stats or give you a passive ability like increasing certain attributes or by giving you a resistance to a certain ailment. Be sure to report back to him every once in a while and see what you can make, because sometimes you might be able to make something that is amazingly powerful, like one sword I'm positive Sophia the Night fans would instantly love. But oh boy, melee weapons and equipment with perks is just the start of what Miriam can do. Now we get to probably the biggest thing that helps deck her out: shards. When you kill an enemy, they might crystallize and give you a shard in the most gruesome way imaginable. It looks painful, and based off this description from Miriam, it almost certainly is. But getting shards will unlock brand new magical attacks and abilities for you to use. There's 5 kinds of shards, technically 6 if you want to count white shards, but those are permanent add-ons that just stack on her and can be turned on and off rather than equipped. There's the red kind, which are just basic magic attacks, the purple kind, which are magic attacks that require aiming with the right analog stick, the blue kind, which grants her an ability for the R1 button, like grabbing certain objects or do the boost from Sonic, the yellow kind, which gives her a passive perk or a stat boost, and finally, green shards, which can be used to summon familiars that can fight alongside you, or provide support in some form. The familiars can even have their own levels, so keeping them out will make them stronger, and thus increase their uses. This is the mechanic that really gives Ritual of the Night its edge. There is a surplus of shards for all these categories, so it's encouraged to keep as many on you as you can, so you can test out which ones you like more, which ones might be ideal for an upcoming boss, or if there's one that might be necessary for progression. Red and purple shards are the biggest example of this. The former has many attacks to choose from, but at the end of the day, you can just press one button and the attack goes. But the range and the strength I got with most of them were excellent with enemies who could take a lot more punishment than usual, and some made some boss encounters much more comfortable. Almost every purple shard requires that you aim with the right analog stick, which might take some getting used to, especially with some being required to progress, but they have good damage output and are generally more accurate. If you get more than one of the same shard, their grade will increase, meaning they will hit harder. And if you have the necessary materials, Johanna's can increase their rank, which gives them other effects. Even though this is cool, I think separating the two honestly complicates a step that should be pretty easy to do. It'd feel much more natural if they got these passive perks along with increasing their strength. With all these shards and all these weapons at your disposal, there are so many different ways you can play this game, along with how each area in terms of design and enemy layout is optimized for whatever style you have. Granted, I do think there are times where things get a little too cramped for my liking, and some instances where I feel like the screen's idea of challenging you is to stuff way too many enemies into a single room, like in this room near the end of the game. There are instances where the game will up things to keep your skills in check, but I wouldn't say it's hard overall. Every enemy has a pattern that has a weakness, and identifying that is key, along with assessing the environment. Boss fights especially kick things up a notch, but in a way that really works. Some are large and command presence, while others are on your level and are much faster to boot. But no matter what, I always look forward to these, as I am anxious to see just what kind of spectacle the fight will provide, and to see what I'll need to do in order to overcome it with ease. And while some are more challenging than others, figuring out the weaknesses to some of these guys and exploring them always feels good. Using all these for exploration feels good too. Many of these areas have several secrets hidden around every corner, and you will definitely be rewarded for keeping a sharp eye out or having a sense of curiosity. And likewise with games of this caliber, getting new upgrades that let you explore parts you couldn't reach before is something I will never tire of. There's even warprints that can take you to certain parts of the map should you get lost or should you want to cut down on backtracking. Some tropes from modern day titles also made their way in here, like going to Todd the Friendly Killer Barber to customize your look, from hairstyle to eye color to even clothing color, to preparing food, which can act as a supplement to potions or replacements if you want to, and can also give you extra shots permanently when you eat them for the first time. That last one is especially handy because those buffs do help, even if you have to go out of your way for some of them. Sometimes getting the ingredients can be pretty obtuse, namely if they require getting other ingredients. Some you get from certain enemies, and some you have to go to this farmer after giving him seeds needed to grow them. It's a little more work than necessary, but I do appreciate this mechanic regardless, and it also makes me hungry from time to time. For the most part, the game is able to keep things moving at a steady pace to minimize burnout, and there aren't that many things that get overly taxing in terms of level design, enemy design, or anything like that. Because of that, I think this can be a good starting point for those who want to give this subgenre a shot. It doesn't ask for a whole lot out of you, and its mechanics are easy to learn, yet difficult to master, and the game just feels rewarding to play through. There's plenty of touches I'm sure fans of Castlevania would love, but it's great if you just want a fun game to play overall. But what I discussed was just the main campaign, because there's tons of other things to do. Boss Rush Mode is 2 courses with 5 bosses each, and I'm pretty sure you can piece together the rest from there. Speedrun Mode is essentially the main game again, only you're on a timer, and there's some things taken to try and keep the pace going, good for those who enjoy that kind of thing. Randomizer Mode is also the main game again, but you can actually change where items appear, and what you can buy in the shop, and even where save and warp rooms appear. Now that doesn't mean you get 2 random shards or 2 random items from the same kinds of enemy, the items and shards instead swap places. But still, getting the speed shard in the first level was admittedly very funny.
Together we can show the world what we can do. You are next to me and I.
There's also the Classic Mode, which is pretty much a separate game entirely. It's basically how a classic Castlevania game would play in Ritual of the Night's engine, which is cool, but in my opinion, it doesn't feel as good to play as the Curse of the Moon games. This one pretty much goes all in with the classic tropes, being sluggish movement, stiff jump, knockback, weird enemy placement, the whole shebang. I mean, it is cool to see this as a stretch goal, and I know those who love the classic titles will really get into this. It's just not for me personally, even though I do like that you can jump on and off stairs. That and Miriam's strutting animation looks pretty funny. That is the walk you do when you're grumpy. But the next 2 are my favorite of the side modes. Boss Revenge Mode places you in control of one of 4 bosses in the game, where you have to fight Zangetsu, Dominique, and Miriam in a row, and you can only restore health after you defeat the first 2. This is really cool, as these bosses play nothing like the other characters, and even their attacks are one-to-one what they use in their respective fights. It is immensely satisfying, but these 3 hunters can put up a fight, so you better learn what you need to do and understand it if you want to beat them. And finally, you can actually play the game again as Zangetsu. Now here there's little to no treasures to find, and no NPCs to interact with. It's just you, whatever health and MP upgrades there are, and the next challenge you choose to take on. But this game lets you take on these challenges in any order depending on where you want to go, even the optional super bosses, which is cool, but it all comes together thanks to one thing. Playing as Zangetsu is great! He moves darn near 2.5 times faster than Miriam, has a great compromise between attack speed, damage output, and range. He can imbue his sword with fire, ice, and electricity to give his normal attacks and his knife sub-weapon more properties. He can double jump. His chain basically lets him latch onto walls and ceilings, refreshing one of his jumps. His dodge activates on a whim, goes far, and can go through enemies. And he has a more advanced version of this dodge that leaves behind plumes of fire that deal even more damage than anything else he can muster. So basically, he's an unstoppable sentinel tearing through demons with a sword. And I have absolutely no problem with that. Heck, if you paid a little extra for the Iga's Backpack DLC, Miriam gets a new weapon, and there's a new boss fight against Iga himself, who fights like Castlevania's version of Dracula, which is awesome! With all these in mind, the game's replay value is absolutely through the roof. The fact that there are so many different ways to play the campaign by default would add a lot, but with the different modes and different characters, those playtime hours are sure to be racked up. I've sunk well over 20 hours into this game for this review, and there's still plenty of things I haven't done, so many weapon types I haven't dabbled into, and so much more. And for that, I can safely say that this game does indeed hit home with me. As someone who hasn't dipped too far into Castlevania, Bloodstained Ritual of the Night did a wonderful job of providing an incredibly fun, incredibly replayable, and incredibly satisfying experience. There's not only so much effort into making it a strong adventure, but so much love and dedication given to scratch an itch that Konami isn't going to be scratching anytime soon. Even despite some weird pacing parts when going for the best ending, and a few things that look a tad cheap, so many other details are so admirable that it completely makes the game overall worth it in the end. And believe it or not, the devs still aren't done with this game. There's apparently a core mode and a versus mode that supports both local and online play currently in the works, something called a chaos mode, which is basically a more difficult boss rush from what I hear, and some special crossover content that's supposed to give us another playable character. The fact that this already meaty game is getting even more content in the future, for free no less, is more reason to give Ritual of the Night your time. It is worth every penny, and I absolutely recommend it. The night is still young, so venture out while you still can. I'm Lang Ripper, and I'm really excited to see where the Bloodstained series goes from here, and how much more of Castlevania's legacy it carries on. and maybe some might want the Castlevania series in general to come back with a new installment, given how much the Netflix show, the collections, and their representation of Smash Ultimate gain attention in the public eye, but I'll be as honest as I can with you. I cannot trust Konami to make a proper continuation of that series. Now, usually I don't like comments like that, as most of the time I come off as very spoiled and self-righteous, in my opinion, but with how much Konami dragged their name through the mud with very bad business practices and lack of care towards their products, I don't have good faith in a good follow-up ever happening, and if they choose to do one, there's a chance we might see another Contra Row Core, or, God forbid, another Metal Gear Survive, and none of us want that. But all the Bloodstained entries have gone on to show us that there is hope for everyone. The heart and spirit that makes Castlevania is right here, and whatever lies in Bloodstained's future will be something I will happily be anticipating. Happy Halloween, everyone!